Anne Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was lovely, and it is highly appropriate that Robin and I met racing to Soldiers Field Daycare to pick up our kids, and our kids are actually still in touch on Facebook, which is particularly nice. And yes, I was going to comment, I love hearing the baby, assuming the baby doesn't wail, but if so, if so, go out and come back. So it's great to be back here. It's really something to see my face on the poster with Deborah Spar. I was a graduate student here with my husband. My husband was in her graduate school class when her oldest son was born. We were at all the graduate school parties. We were in our late 20s, early 30s, and there was this baby. And it was kind of all of our baby in the sense that she was the one of 2 or 3 people, I think, with other faculty who had kids. And we all sort of had this sense that this was, she was always on the fast track. So it's very nice then to see where she is now and to actually share the opening week of the 50th, the celebration of 50 years of women at the business school with her. I was on email with her earlier today, and it just makes it particularly special. I want to do a couple of things. I want to talk about why I wrote the article in a little more detail than I gave you in the article, and in part in response to some of the responses to it about why I might have written it. I want to talk to you about the responses I've gotten, which have, and in different categories. I mean, I have gotten hundreds and hundreds of responses, and there are thousands more on the web, and but there's some broad categories. And then I do want to talk about where I think we go from here. I am writing a book. It'll come out in the spring of 2014. I'm thinking hard about these questions, so some of what I will give you will change, and one of the reasons I like engaging audiences like you is I'm learning a lot as you ask questions and we have a discussion. So let me start with why I wrote it. So I told you in the article, I said, look, my own instincts were not to write it. This colleague of mine said, you can't write it. Many people, I think, of my own generation would say that. And then I gave this talk to this group of Rhodes Scholars, and they said, you had to write it. And I thought, well, wait a minute. If this is their reaction, and this was the reaction of many of my own students, many of the women's groups I talked to. So I knew that it was important for this generation, for all of you, to put this out there. And that was what made me decide to do it. But I say in the article that the feminist assumptions on which I built my career were shifting under my feet, and that this was part of the trigger. And this has been widely interpreted as an attack on feminism. That somehow I'm saying that feminism promised me this and I didn't get it, and so now I'm changing my views. That's not at all what I meant, but the way it's been misinterpreted has forced me to think through what I did mean. When I said that, I wrote the feminist assumptions on which I based my career. So I've always assumed I was going to work, and honestly, if you had, I've always been totally focused on my career. It's defined who I am. If you wake me up in the middle of the night, I'll tell you I'm a foreign policy expert. I'll also tell you I'm a mother and a wife and a daughter, but my career has always been central. If you told me before I went to Washington that this job that I had wanted for a long, long time, and I couldn't go into the Clinton administration in '92 because I was getting tenure. In '96, I had a 2-month-old. In 2000, the Dems didn't win. In 2004, the Dems didn't win. So, I'm kind of getting on by 2008. So it's taken a long time, and I'm finally ready, and my party wins, and I can actually get this job. If you'd said to me, you've wanted to be doing foreign policy and government your whole life, and you're going to get there, and you're going to work for this unbelievable Secretary of State, and you're going to think she just hangs the moon, and you're going to have a chance to go on. And again, your party's not in power always, and these jobs are rare, and you're going to say, no, I'm going home to be with my kids. I'd have said, you really don't know me very well. You don't know sort of how I've constructed my life, and I will somehow make it work, because I'd always made it work. So what shifted was not feminism. Feminism is about, equality between men and women, and that promise, a promise I still believe in and still work for. What shifted was my own feelings about what I wanted. And that was a shock to me, because I would have told you, and I think my mother would have told you, my friends would have told you, I wouldn't have made that choice. When I did make that choice, and it felt like the right choice, and it still feels like the right choice, although it was not an unconflicted choice. And it's a good thing it took me a year to write the article, because I had to work through it. It made me see the choices of other women differently. You know, before that, if a woman told me, you know, I'm not taking that promotion, I'd have had this response that was like, oh, that's really too bad. And it wouldn't have been negative, but it wouldn't have been all that positive. And when I made that choice, I realized, wait just a minute. You know, I need to reevaluate. And part of the reasons I need to write this article is because I now see this whole issue in a very different way. But it was really about a shift in myself that I just didn't anticipate. Nobody told me I was going to feel that way when I had a child who clearly needed me at home, but also, as I write in the article, I wanted to be at home. I didn't want to have children, and it was hard to have children, and I love my sons. I didn't want to look back at the end of my life and think, you know, those last 5 years when they were home, I wasn't there. Because that time will never come back. And I do hope the Dems will win again at some point in my lifetime. I hope soon, actually, but regardless, not in the next 4 years. So that's really the first reason. The second is, I've addressed young people for many, many years, and young women who would say to me, how do you do it? How do you put work and family together? And I would say, well, you know, it helps that I'm a tenured professor at a major institution, and my husband is a tenured professor at a major institution. I understand that that gives us tremendous flexibility. We work like crazy, but we have summers, we have time. We can manage our time. The only thing I have to be at is class, and honestly, if it's bad enough, I can even reschedule a class, although you almost never do that. And I knew that that flexibility was important. I wasn't an idiot. I understood that we had it very good, and I would say that. What working in Washington on somebody else's schedule, even a boss I adored and considered a privilege to have worked for, working on someone else's schedule in a way that meant I really couldn't control my own time, I realized flexibility wasn't just important, it had actually been indispensable. And that gave me a different perspective on what needs to change, that it was essential, that without that, I simply couldn't make it. When my child, needed me, and it was harder because I was 2.5 hours away by train, or 3.5 hours, but even so, he needed me, I had to be at a meeting, and he had an uncanny ability to have issues on days I had important meetings. So that was the second thing that really made a difference. And the third, and this is the hardest to talk about, but I mean, just in the sense it's delicate. I'm used to getting lots and lots of positive feedback as a role model. Indeed, I was saying earlier that my sons even, see me as a role model. They've been told this by other women. I'm used to being affirmed as somebody who works, who has a powerful career and who has succeeded to a certain degree. When I came back from Washington, I would go to all these parties, and people would say, "Why'd you leave?" And I would say exactly what Robin said, which is, you have a 2-year public service leave. Larry Summers left after 2 years. I left after 2 years. There's nothing unusual about that. Your tenure is up. And so you choose at that point, do you want to risk losing tenure? Most academics go back. And they would all nod and smile and say, yes, absolutely. Well, it was great that you served and wonderful and great to have you back. And what's next? That was about how the conversation would go. And then I would say, and I'd say it really deliberately because I wanted to put this out there. I was feeling, and I would say, but even if I could have stayed, and I might have been able to ask, for instance, for another year, and I might have been able to leave tenure, and after, in a couple of years, you hope your colleagues will still have you back. After a certain amount of time, they won't. But I said, even if I could have stayed, I wouldn't have. I would have come home because I've got 2 teenage sons at home, and they both need both parents at home, and I really don't want to miss these next 4 years. And I got a completely different reaction. It was like the reaction at a cocktail party where people are looking over your shoulder to see who else they could talk to. It was immediately this kind of, many people said, and many women, what a pity, which just drove me crazy. It's like, wait a minute, what a pity? What a pity that I want to be home with my children who both need me and I want to be there with them. And what kind of reaction is that? Or a sort of, I could just sort of see myself being lowered in their esteem. We are all sensitive to microbehaviors. We are all very aware of what is valued and what is not. And I suddenly found myself in a position that I know many of my friends have been in. I know many women that obviously have made these choices, and I suddenly realized what it felt like. So from my perspective, I was, in some sense, it was a revelation that I had been on the other side of this debate, and I would have probably said that beforehand that, if you didn't take that promotion, it was at least in part a reflection of your commitment to your career. I now come back and say, no way, there's nobody less committed or more committed to their career than I am, but that doesn't mean that it isn't equally legitimate to fulfill your responsibility and your desire to those you love in your life. So that's where I decided I really had to write the piece, and some of those issues are very tricky to talk about, and they make people mad, including, and they make people quite defensive. But I think we do have to discuss them. And the facts are the facts, that the numbers of women at the top are 20% at best. The only place that it is 50-50, women and men, the one place, absolutely, Ivy League university presidents. And there's a reason for that, right? That's the flexible profession. There are 4 women and 4 men. So then that's because we do have what it takes. We have the flexibility, we have the ability to run our careers, and I think all of those women have children. So, okay, so that's why I really felt like I had to write the article. Let me talk about the responses. So the first wave of responses, and I've been getting them this week, since yesterday when I've been at Harvard, mostly from your generation, is gratitude. And it's a funny reaction. It's like, thank you for putting this issue on the table. Thank you for writing this. Thank you for putting it out there. And I keep sort of thinking, why did it take courage, or why was it important to be able to do that? I mean, but it clearly is, right? It opened up a conversation. I'm not the first person to write this, and in fact, I quote people in the article. I'm by no means the first person to raise this. But for this generation, that is what I get overwhelmingly. And I get many emails that are just heart-wrenching. And they all start with, I cried when I read your article. And then they go on to talk about their life story. And these are women who say, I came out of school in the 80s or the 90s. I had a full, a great education. I was going to be X. I started work. I had children, my husband lost his job, I had a sick child, or I had 2 children. It just was impossible to do what I had to do. And so I took a different job and I fell off the career track. And now I feel like I have failed my younger self, or I have betrayed my younger self, or I feel like such a failure. And thank you for making me feel less of a failure. And then I would cry. I mean, that's it. They're just heart-wrenching. The idea that is these women's fault? No, it's not an individual fault. It's that we have said you have the same options as men do, but we have not actually supported women to be able to both be caregivers and providers, or men, and I'll get to that in a minute. But these are incredibly powerful emails, and one of the reasons I want to write a book is to tell their stories. I want to actually publish some of these stories that are so amazingly powerful and far more moving than my own story, which is a story, ultimately of both privilege and luck. But the second category of responses are criticism. And there's a lot of personal criticism. There are a lot of people who think I'm complaining because I don't have it all. That's not true. I have had it all. I have a career, I have a family, and I'm very happy in both. So those are pretty easy to dismiss. Then they're the ones that say, I must be a real perfectionist and I want everything to be perfect, and to which I would just invite you all to my house. It would take you 3 seconds to realize that is not the case. That was Rebecca Roiphe's take in the Financial Times. So those you can put out of the way. There's a second category of responses, though, of criticism in the critical category that I think you have to pay much more attention to. And there are 2 varieties of those. One is you're hurting the cause. You are setting the cause of women back because you are basically telling them, and by them it's really the men that run the world, it's not spelled out that way, but that's what it's meant, that women are less committed to their careers, and they're going to be more likely to take time out or change the way they work because they have children, and that will be an excuse not to hire them, not to promote them. And this is why my colleagues to begin with said you can't write that, right? You can't write that. You cannot acknowledge that this is something that you think is important and that I think men feel also, but I'm writing as a woman and I'm writing about other women, so this is going to set back the cause. Maybe that's right. I have the view that I look at all of you and I think if we're not hiring you, it's the employer's problem. It is also our problem as women, but you cannot compete in this global economy without using all your talent. And not to be able to recruit or retain really talented women, not to use all their skills at the very top. I think we're past the point where you say you just don't hire. I really do. I think there are firms that understand that they have to retain. I don't think we're all the way there yet, but we're now at a place where when I grew up, I didn't know any women, doctors, lawyers, judges, or anything. I did not know any woman growing up in Virginia who had a career. By the time I got to law school, I knew of one woman lawyer. My 14-year-old, when we were watching the debate, it was actually the Democratic Convention and John Kerry speaking, and my 14-year-old said, "So who's that?" And I said, "Well, that's John Kerry." And he said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, he ran for president in 2004, and he's a senator, and if President Obama is elected, he might be Secretary of State." And my 14-year-old said, without thinking, "You mean a guy can be Secretary of State?" So, again, I think we got a long way, we still got a ways to go, but I think we have come far enough as a society that you can take the risks of opening up this issue, and it's not going to set back the cause of men and women being equal. It's going to advance it because it's going to force us to confront this issue. If you can't name it, you can't change it. So some way, and you may not agree with the way I named it, but we've got to be able to frame it and change it. The second strand of that kind of criticism says, I shouldn't have written the article because I am discouraging all younger women. That this is not what you want to hear, that you need to hear that it's going to be fine. And it is going to be fine if we make these changes, but the view is, look, don't say anything other than yes, you can do it. And there, again, I think it's important to be honest, and I honestly think from the women all of your generation that I've talked to, you realize that this is really hard, and that we need to debate it. So that's the second category of response. The third is from men. I certainly didn't expect this. I've heard from lots and lots of men. I've heard from fathers who have said, and many, a lot of Princetonians have written me because I was a dean and I'm a faculty member, and there's a sort of sense that they can, have a particular bond, and so they've written me. And many are fathers who, I don't know what they did with their own wives. I suspect that they didn't think about these issues very much in the 70s and the 80s or the 60s and the 70s, but they've seen their daughters educated, professionally educated, entering the workforce, having kids, and facing these issues. And they are not happy about it. And they're not happy about what that means. And these are their grandchildren, and these are their daughters, and so they're wrestling with these issues. So I've heard from a lot of fathers. And then I've heard from lots of men who say, we don't have it all either. And having it all, again, just means having a career and a family. Doesn't mean having everything you want. Having it all in my generation meant you could have a career and a family too. But I've heard from lots of men who said, if I want to take time out to be with my children, if I want to take flex time, if I want to take paternity leave, I am every bit as much constrained or more as the women in my office. I will be seen as less of a guy. I will be seen as not one of the guys. If I say, I can't go out with you and have a beer after work because I have to go pick up my kid from daycare, or have to do the school run, or I have to be at home with my kid because my wife is doing X, Y, or Z, that is not okay. and that there are many men who have written and have written publicly as well, saying, the only way to change this is to change this for men and women, but it is very, very hard for men to break the gender stereotype in a different way than women, but that they are equally prisoners of a gender stereotype. And that, I think, is very interesting. I've been exploring it. And lots of other people are exploring it. It's, again, something in a book that in writing a book I want to look much more into. My husband also, there have been men who have written me, who have asked me to have my husband write to prove that he is an alpha male. For the record, yes. It doesn't really, I'm not sure, I think he needs to be alpha, but he's certainly a very strong, comfortable man and very comfortable with his choices and has an amazing relationship with our sons. The kind of relationship that I think he would say is exactly something that has brought a huge amount to his life. And my father would say he looks at both my sons, my husband and my brothers, and says, look, this is something that is just hugely rewarding, whether you're a mother or a father or simply a parent. Okay, so those are the three categories of sort of gratitude and criticism, and also this sort of response from men. The last thing I'll just say that has just surprised me is the global reaction has been astonishing. Just astonishing, and it continues. Every single week I get invitations to be interviewed in Japan, in Scandinavia, in Australia, in India, in Brazil, in South Africa. I mean, it's just stunning to me that this would cause a global reaction, but it has. So where do we go? And here I'll say some of what I said in the article and a little bit more that I've been thinking about. So flexibility is essential. And it's the kind of flexibility you need to be able to stay in the game so that your career is cumulative, right? To get to the top, you have to be constantly building on a set of skills. Now, fortunately, it is not so clear anymore that you have to simply climb every rung at the ladder at one place. Very few of you are going to stay at the same place for the course of your careers. Indeed, my students seem to think 5 years is an eternity in thinking about their careers. But you definitely have to be building your skills portfolio. So if I start as a teacher, I can teach and write and speak, and then if I become a manager, then I can administer, and then you administer at higher levels. You start to gain skills of leadership, and each of those has to be cumulative if eventually you're going to say, yeah, look at my whole portfolio of skills. So that means that you have to have the flexibility to stay in some dimension of the career you've chosen, either in your job or in a related job that will be additive in a way that also allows you to be a parent. And that can come in many different ways. And fortunately here, the fact that we're in a global economy is helping. You cannot take calls round the clock in the office. You do have to work from home at this point. From my brother's an investment banker, and he will say he has no idea where people are on these calls, right? I mean, they're all over the world. They could be at home in their PJs. They could be on the golf course for all he knows, but yet you do have to be on the phone. Now, that is not the perfect solution, because actually kids notice when you're on the phone, and when you have babies, that's not an option, but it does help. Working from home 1 day a week, I am so much more productive. If I've got to get work done, the last place I want to be is the office. I mean, the kind of creative thinking work that is not responding to email, but that is actually coming up with a strategy or coming up with writing a report or thinking about something hard, well, I need flexibility, I need time, I need space, I need the ability to take a walk around the block if I need to, or longer. So there too, you can actually be more productive if you have different rhythms. You're in the office some of the time, you're elsewhere some of the time. And the flexibility to say, and this is again where academia really works, you can dial up or down how much you do. So you're still doing the same thing. If you're an academic, you can write 5 articles a year, or 2 articles a year, or 1 article a year, but you're still in the game. So we need flexibility on multiple dimensions, and I do think that's coming. I would recommend you that you look at the it's on the Sloan, the Work and Families Foundation, run by Ellen Galinsky in New York. They give the Sloan Awards for firms that make work work, and they are fabulous firms. They're firms all over the country, all different industries, and they are firms that have really pioneered how you make work work for parents. And you can look at what they've done and you'll be surprised just at how flexible. And they include things like making it possible to bring kids to work. You know, the Deputy Secretary of State brought his kids in and put them in one of the little rooms up there on the 7th floor when they were between school and camp. His wife works full time. Now that's not a full-time solution, but hey, if you've got a week and that's the only way you can do it, fine. The secretary was perfectly cool with it because she's the secretary, and she certainly understood. She thought that this was important. So there are all sorts of ways you can ease those transitions. So flexibility is hugely important, but it's not enough because there is, part of this is just if you're a parent and that's taking, a big chunk of time every week, and you're working and that's taking a big chunk of time every week, there still are a finite number of hours, even if you can, fly to Japan and add 13 hours onto your day. So ultimately, we do have to elongate the span of time over which we are both professionals and parents. And biologically, we need to be parents in the earlier part of that time. If you're 20 today, if you're a woman who is 20, and I'm doing the research on this, so I don't have all the figures, but the actuarial tables say you will live to 100. It's a long time, right? That's a long time. You could have kids, grandkids, great-grandkids in that period of time. If you're thinking about that, do you really want to get your career, hit the top of your career at 55? It's like a long time on the other end. Really? I look at it and think, no way. I would much rather, I like having things to look forward to. I like challenges. I like to think I'm going to continue learning and doing things. I would much rather think I'm going to get to a place and then I'm going to have kids and I'm going to really enjoy that, and that's going to be a part of my life that's going to teach me a lot, and I'm going to grow and I'm going to invest in my own future. I hope they'll still be around when I'm decrepit and they can take care of me. And then I want to think, the empty nest, this is not some, mother bird going, oh, what do I do now? I'm thinking 6:30 to 8:30 every morning. I don't have to spend getting them to school. Do you know what I can do with that time? You've got suddenly a whole nother burst of energy and ability to do any number of things. And wouldn't you rather think about that until you're 70 or 80 and then think about traveling around the world and doing whatever you want to do when you retire? The idea of sitting there from 60 to 100, retired, no chance. So we really do have to elongate this. And fortunately, demographics are with us, right? How on earth are we going to get rid of the deficit unless people are working longer? Because we don't have, you can support me, but ultimately, I'm the height of the baby boom, and you're going to see, we don't want to stop working. We're going to want to keep working, but we're going to want to work part-time, flex time, all sorts of different ways, and ways that I think actually really will make this easier to do. But ultimately, it has to change, not just in terms of flexibility of work, but the arc of the career. The last thing really is a norm change. As I said, the idea that when I would say to people, I came home because I would lose my tenure and that's fine, but I say I came home because I want to be with my kids and that's not, there is something really wrong with that. There's just something really wrong with that. As a society, think about it this way. When we elect a president, he's got to be there with his wife and shiny kids, or she's got to be there with her husband and shiny kids, right? We don't tend to elect leaders who don't have families. It's one of the things you think about when you think about the sort of standard political narrative. Now, why is that? Why is it that we immediately want to see that our leaders have families? Well, maybe it's because we want to see that they have human connections, that they love others in their life, that they live up to their responsibilities to their others that they love in their lives. And it isn't just their kids. Remember John McCain and his mother, and how important that is to see somebody connected to other human beings is enormously important to us when we choose our leaders. That's because that's half of who we are. You know, I'm a big believer in Virginia Woolf and A Room of One's Own. It was a very important book for me to read, and for those of you who haven't read it, she says if you want to write fiction, you have to have money and a room of your own. Means you have to have a certain independence and you have to have your own identity. And for generations and centuries, women were defined in terms of their responsibility to others, as a mother, a daughter, a wife, a sister, rather than their own identity. So I am all for that. But that room in my life, and it isn't for everybody, although everybody's part of some family, whether you have kids or not, you're still part of some family. It may be a constructed one. That room is a room in a house. It's a room with other people, and in that house there are other people, and there are people you love. And that is part of what makes you human. It's part of what makes you a person of worth, of character. I mean, when I think about the way I raise my own kids, I raise them to live up to their responsibilities, to deal honestly with other people. So the idea we have to actually live up to the values we espouse. We talk about family. We require our leaders to demonstrate that they have good family relationships. We talk about investing in the next generation. We talk about caring about children. But in our day-to-day interactions, we do not value that. You are valued much more for what you attain professionally than what you actually, it's not attain, because mothering is not, or parenting is not about attaining something, but about who you are as a person. And I will say that goes for a family, it also goes for a community, it goes for our society as citizens. That sense of nurturing our relations with other human beings is a core part of who we are. So ultimately, I'm optimistic about this because I grew up in Virginia, as I keep telling you. The other thing that happened in Virginia in the 60s and the 70s, Virginia is where they grow tobacco, and my mother used to put out little vases with cigarettes at every dinner party. That was part of a dinner party. I mean, you're all looking at me like, you've got to be kidding, right? Can you imagine having a dinner party and putting out cigarettes? Well, yeah, that's what you did. And as late as the 1990s, you know, smoking was cool. And think about all the cigarette ads, right? In one decade, fundamentally, smoking went from something that was fine and cool, cigars, cigarettes, pipes, to something you wish you didn't do and aren't likely to admit if you do it, or at least past a certain age in high school. So that's a huge norm shift. That is an enormous norm shift. You know, go back, look at movies, read novels. People have been smoking for centuries. And suddenly we see it differently. It is perfectly possible to hit that tipping point and for your generation to change the norms around work, family, professional, personal, provider, caregiver. And I hope very much you're going to be part of making that happen. I hope that I can turn the conversation around this article and make it into a book and help that motivate action. And I think we will all be not only better off as a society, but much happier as a result. Thank you. Questions? Happy to take them. Questions? Yes?
So you talk about the importance of flexibility in being able to develop your career and have your career and have your life. How do you explain then that in Europe, for example, where they have a lot of social systems and work systems that in theory and practice help you develop your family as well? How do you explain that they're being a female working in Europe, first of all, there are significantly fewer leaders in European industry, and politics maybe less. But how do you explain that Europe, let's say, is behind the U.S. If they have social systems that support careers better?
Well, so the first thing I will just say, I think the quality of life is so much higher in Europe. It's not funny. I mean, you know, we spend time in Italy every summer. You know, the Europeans, if you look at productivity hour by hour, they are every bit as productive. They work less, so if you aggregate that, they're less productive. But hour by hour, they are as productive as we are. They understand that taking time off makes you more productive, not less. Now, I don't think you need 6 weeks vacation. I think a month would be phenomenal. If you think about spreading it out over the year and the time for holidays, et cetera, I have always subscribed to the idea that I can do 12 months of work in 11 months. You know, that if I get time off, I am just so much more productive and effective because I've actually been able to sort of refresh your brain like you refresh your muscles. I also think the emphasis, on family, one of the reasons we go to Italy is just to spend time with family, to sit around a table. They still eat at tables. They actually, cook and they sit around and they enjoy life. So I actually think that we could learn there, but I don't think we're going to become France or Sweden. So what you said is very important. In Scandinavia, where they've gone the furthest in terms of, in Scandinavia, in some countries, every man gets a year paternity leave. He gets it only, his wife only gets maternity leave if he takes paternity leave. You can't do it either one. So you want anybody taking time off for the child, you both have to take time off for the child. And that's legislated. They actually want to do that in Germany as well. I like the equality of that, but they have many women in government. They have far fewer women in the private sector, and you know why. I'm in a business school. So I don't see that solution. I don't see us mandating a year off, and they have made great strides publicly, but they're worried still about how you do this privately. So what I would say is every country has to fix this, in their own way. There are ways in which I think it is better to be a woman in Europe, but then there are other ways in which I think it's much worse to be a woman in Europe, and I would much rather that we find our own solution that fits with our particular culture. And, I would say the interest in this article in Europe has been very interesting. The French are not paying attention because they don't believe in feminism, but everybody else Scandinavian women have said we don't, we still have a long way to go. We need to change because it's not working in the private sector. Yeah.
So, first of all, thank you for such an interesting talk. I'm from Mexico, and I used to work in a women's development organization. And one of the things that we've seen there is that you have, historically, you have waves. The first wave was men only, and it was a long wave, obviously. Then you have this wave of women's only. And do you see any shift, or do you see any barriers that need to be thrown down so that, as we did in the organization, it was not only women's only and men's only, but everyone together?
So do you mean people, the subject of development or the people doing development?
The people who actually get into it. So just as an example, you get into HBS as a man, and you're not invited to the WSA, right? So that's automatic. So that's actually created a silo where men are not being able to enter. And by the end of your talk, you were discussing on what is going on next. And one of the things that, at least in the organization we believed in, was that it is no longer time to say women's only and men's only. It's actually time to say, okay, everyone together. If you want to opt out, that's fine. But we cannot opt out for you since the very beginning.
Yeah. So the first thing to say is I do think that going forward, this is not a woman's issue. It's a human issue. And indeed, I'm looking at Kunal, who wrote this wonderful piece, if any of you haven't read it, called Man Up and What Men Have to Do, from Harvard Business School. That made my day when I read it this summer. So I do think this has got to be something, what I tell young men and women in firms is you need to talk about it with men and women together in terms of what you want to talk about, what you want. It can't just be women who ask about parental leave. It's got to be both. But the question of, do women still need a room of their own? I think they do until we get further. I think you need both. Ideally, you would have both a group that is men and women, but I still think just that where you have a group that really will still only say some things when only that group is in the room, and that could be African Americans, it could be Hispanics, it could be Asians, it could be anybody, but it's certainly true of women, then you have to still give them that space. And what I know, and this was one of the things I was doing in the article, I was just putting out publicly what I had heard in many places privately. But as long as that's true, and I guess men could say, well, that's true for us too, but men have clubs and things they can where they can only hang out with other guys. I think you have to still allow both. And so I wouldn't necessarily insist that the Women's Association open the doors to men. I would say that all the events should be open, and that they appear to be. Yeah.
Sorry, now that the article's out there, and you've had all the responses and all the reaction, and you've described, the sort of backlash and the support that you've had, is there anything that you would change about what you wrote? Or, even the headline, which I'm not sure you had control over, because I know sometimes writers don't. Though what, women still can't have it all, then you get backlash, well, neither can men, and what does it having it all mean? And then that line about, feminism should be beneath your feet, and you kind of described how that's not really what you meant. Is there anything that you would kind of change about how you put it out there?
Well, I've thought a lot about the title. I mean, some things you just don't know how they're going to be read until you write them, and that's, I've learned a lot from how people responded. And in 13,000 words, it's not surprising that people are going to take things differently. The title I've thought a lot about. I was uncomfortable with the title, but on the other hand, I did not understand that people would have it all as have everything you want, because my generation really did understand it as work and family. Knowing that, I will no longer use it. You will not see that in the book title. But I do keep asking myself, so if I had said, men and women need equal choices around career and family, I'm not sure a lot of people would have read it. And so I have to look at the Atlantic and say, look, they are in the business of selling magazines, and ultimately I wanted to start a conversation, and that happened, even if it meant a certain amount of misunderstanding, which was probably bound to happen anyway. So I'm not sure I regret the way it came out, because I do think that triggered the conversation, but I've learned a lot from it, and I will be changing my vocabulary in future. Yeah.
Jamie Dimon was here today, and he's actually asked a similar question that you brought up today, whether women could be involved in investment banking, an area where they historically haven't had a major presence. And his basic answer was, there are some areas where you just can't have it all, I guess. And do you believe that there are these areas where if you are a man or a woman who wants to have like a reasonable family life, where you just should avoid that area?
I do think one of the implications of asking men and women to think about this early, which is what I'm saying, is you do need to think through, are you choosing the right profession? And you see this in medicine. You see women concentrated in some areas rather than others. I would rather see that in terms of, men and women. What I would say is I think it's true that there are careers in which, as I said, you're a provider and a caregiver. I think there are careers in which it's easier to be both, and then there are careers in which it is much easier if one person is primarily the provider and the other is primarily the caregiver. And I would say investment banking is one of those where I think women can absolutely do it. But, look at Sheryl Sandberg's husband, look at Marissa Mayer's husband. They are not having high-powered, structured careers. They are going to be the one who is more at home. And when I was a dean, my husband was definitely more at home. Now, I was certainly, I'm mom and I'm caregiving, but there were, there are nights where my kids woke up and called for him. And my immediate reaction was, no, I'm your mom. But my next reaction was no, right? That you can't have all of that. So there is, I would say, unless, given the amount of travel, the way you're going to get equality in some of those professions is not because men and women are going to stop traveling, although I think there's some things we could do. But it is more like it's got to become easier for men to say, hey, I've got a wife who's an investment banker and she's making an amazing living and we've got this great life and I am the one who is the primary caregiver, just as often it's men now. But that's where I say a lot of this, investment banking is an incredibly macho culture. And that's got to change in terms of saying it is okay if a guy wants to make the same trade-off that a woman makes. And it seems to me there's no reason not, but most guys, have not felt validated if they make that choice rather than the wife makes that choice. There was somebody in the back, yeah.
You mentioned that, in actuarial science, women at the age of 20 can live to 100. That idea of elongating your career along with balancing your family. But it's my understanding that there's also a different sort of bias for an older population of either staying in the workforce or that they are perceived as maybe not being in the know of everything. Like, how do you balance this idea of elongating your career past, working from 60 to 100, and also having your family while also fighting that other bias of a younger generation trying to push you out?
Well, so that's why I said demographics are with us. Just watch the cultural norm shift. I am the height of the baby boom, and I have watched marketing change at every stage of my life. When I was worried about wrinkles, guess what? Every single product out there is advertising to me because I am the peak. You're going to see all sorts of articles about the value of wisdom and experience. I'm telling you, 80's going to be the new 60. I really mean it. And there are other cultures that value wisdom and experience much more than we do. And demographically, again, since your generation is much smaller than mine, I think you will see some of this shift. That said, I was talking earlier today, there's an enormous gap between my generation and yours in terms of technology. I mean, there's just an enormous gap, and people who do want to stay in the game are going to have to stay more current with what's happening. I think that keeps you young. I mean, and I'm in academia, people live longer, and they stay in the game because they're constantly stimulating their brains in valuable ways. But I think more like it is that people will start to think, I want the most out of my entire life. And if the only way I can do that is to not to sort of spend 40 years having kids and then 40 years having a career, that's not going to work. But as I said, to intertwine them in ways that allow you to get the most out of both. So you get the most out of your career in the times where you're totally focused on your career, but you also really get the most out of your family life, which again is an investment, right? I love my children, but I'm quite serious that I'm investing in my own future happiness, not because I think they're going to support me, although that might be nice, but I want to have them in my life later. I want to have a rich family life. I have an enormously rich family life with my parents and my siblings. I want that going forward. I don't want my kids, unhappy with me or estranged from me or any of and part of what I'm doing is investing. You're putting money in the family bank. And I think there are ways that people can see that will, they may not, everybody may not work till 80, but if you're even working till 70, right now the assumption is you peak in investment banking you peak at 50, but you peak at 55 to 60, and then you head down. And that just isn't working if you have kids in your late 30s. It's just not going to work. Yeah.
So right on this point, I think what you're referring to is what a lot of us would call the pregnant pause, which is this idea of pausing your career while you pump out those children. And it honestly just hasn't been something that a lot of women have found workable
Yep.
because they're viewed as having skills that deteriorate
Yep.
while they're not in the workforce. We see it in some careers like consulting, and we see it in academia. But I'm just not really sure that a lot of firms are open to the idea that you can learn different skills or that you can keep up when you're out of the workforce to achieve career.
Yeah, I mean, and again, part of that's one of the reasons I was talking about flexibility. So say that when you're in a law firm, you're in a consulting firm, and you get pregnant and you have your kids, you can stay in on a project basis. Let's not talk about part-time or full-time. I actually don't think that's a very useful way to go. And again, in terms of a flexible workforce, increasingly you're customizing the kind of work you do. And so let's say you're working on a case, on a project, but you are able to stay in the game. So your skills are still there, but you're doing less. So that it isn't this binary choice. I think that is hugely important. And it isn't, I'm not sure your skills actually degrade, but you're out of the loop, right? And it's hard to get back in. So one way to do it really is to make it possible, and again, for men as well as women, to dial it up and dial it down is the way I would put it. The other, and I do think you're starting to see this, is women and men who are parents are getting together and creating their own versions of law firms and consulting practices and simply proving that they can do it just as well or even better. And there too, your ability to create your own professional version of what you do is better now than it's ever been. In fact, the Coase theorem's really reversed. It's in many ways the costs of having a firm are greater than the cost of not having one and getting your accounting done here and your personnel done there. I know law partners who have left their firms and continued their practices. Now again, you have to have built something up. But I see no reason why there won't be competition among people who find like-minded people, parents as well as men as well as women, who can offer competition and prove that that's just not right. You see this most in doctors, where I've talked to 3 or 4 different women doctors who've just created a practice with other parents, and they support each other in a way that works, and they are making their practice work. I know it's, again, investment banking may be the hardest nut to crack. Consulting, I don't think so much. What? Last question. I have not gone anywhere over here. Does anybody over here want to ask a question? Nobody over here wants to ask a question. All right, you'll have the last.
So you mentioned a lot of industries where consulting, investment banking, doctors, they're very profession-oriented versus industry-oriented, where you might come in at a level and you're trying to advance up to C-suite. Do you think that's possible? Let's say energy or technology, manufacturing, etc., where you can do something where projects don't exist. You're in a job and it's a job. It continues hour by hour, as opposed to on a client perspective.
Yeah, and so first of all, I have to plead ignorance in the sense that part of the reason I'm writing the book is to look at what is being done, and there's been a ton of work done. You've got one of the masters right here in terms of what actually is being done, and there is a lot. It's different than what I was suggesting. There again, partly I still think you can think about your career in terms of a portfolio of skills, and if you don't necessarily get them all at the same company, if you think, well, I've done this at this company and I've done this at this company, so the idea that you're punching all those buttons at one company may also shift. But I also still think that to retain the talent that these companies, they've hired you, they've trained you, they want to be able to keep you. And the question is to show them how in such a way that you can actually do it. In technology, it absolutely should be possible, again, given the nature of the work. I do consulting for Google. No one has any idea where everybody is. It's actually, they have all these offices, and you just work wherever you happen to be going into the office. They have issues around sort of the cult of FaceTimes. You can be anywhere, but they still want you to be more in the office. But all I can say is there are lots of examples where even traditional companies are making changes. Some of those really do involve also allowing parents to bring their kids in sort of not all the time, but in crisis situations. That I think that our best bet is to disseminate knowledge so that you can say, when you're asking for something, look, our competitor right here, they do this, look at their rankings, or and compare, so that you're actually speaking the language of competition, but you're making a case that this is good business. Thank you all.